we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for being here. I do have a few housekeeping notes before we get started with our presentations. I'm Rebecca Brown with the Habitat Strategic Initiative Lead, and I work at the Department of Natural Resources. And we've got a bunch of people here on the call today, and so if you're interested and willing, I'd really encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and affiliation. And if you are one of the really wonderful and awesome folks who've helped put this on, I'd also encourage you to note that in your chat introduction because it's too many people for us to go through in the time that we have. So today we'll include several presentations exploring the intersection of housing and urban tree canopy, followed by some time for some virtual discussions. And I will warn you now, we are going to do breakout rooms. And then we will have some time to come back from the breakout rooms for a larger group discussion. And then for those of us who are willing and able and interested, uh, we are having an in-person networking event as well at Uptown Grill in Olympia for 5:15 to 7:15 or so. And then, yeah, so, and then we may have time between speakers for questions, but we will have time at the end after the breakout rooms for your questions. So if you've got some good ones, hang on to them. And then, of course, you can also put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. And then for those of you seeking AICP certification maintenance credits, you do need to stay for the full 2 hours. So first, we're going to have a welcome. And it was Brad here to welcome us in from the APA South Sound.
I haven't seen Brad, Rebecca. I'm happy to say a quick welcome if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great, Veronica. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Never care. So if Brad, you happen to jump on, please interject. But us here in Thurston County and in the South Sound are always happy to learn about new topics and expand our reach as planners. And Rebecca, Heidi, Mike, many others that have been involved in planning this. It's a really interesting topic, and we're just really happy to be able to share it with those across the state. So I just do really want to thank everyone for providing the opportunity for others. And as Rebecca mentioned, if you want planning credits, stay the whole time. But really pleased to have everyone here. Thanks again for showing up. That's all I need.
That's great. Thank you, Veronica. Next, we're going to have Heidi spend a few minutes telling everybody about the Puget Sound recovery world. So Heidi, if you're ready to go with your slides, welcome.
All right. Hello, everybody on such a beautiful afternoon. Welcome, welcome. So, strategic initiative leads, we call them SILs. So, in 2015, EPA established this strategic initiative lead structure between habitat, shellfish, and stormwater, recognizing that it's sort of artificial because everything really is about land use itself and habitat. And we have all in these teams developed what are called implementation strategies. And these strategies form what I would call the house foundation of our work. And the SILs work with the Puget Sound Partnership, local integrating organization, and hundreds of collaborators across community groups, nonprofits, tribes, and research consortiums. So I'm being a little bit cheeky here, but we are grateful for the enormous infusion of capital from EPA or the taxpayers for our Puget Sound work. It comes from EPA's geographic programs. Think about Chesapeake Bay and other estuaries across the United States. For our team, at least, the money goes to ecology as the fiscal lead, and then we compete out money in the form of RFPs and occasional contract direct awards. The Puget Sound Partnership, which many of you are probably familiar with, was established by Washington state law and is considered responsible for Puget Sound recovery. However, we do work in concert with hundreds of partners, including the SILs. And so I call it a giant mosh pit or the whole enchilada. There really are a lot of people that are involved, and the least of which are the people that we give money to that we call subawardees. So if you live here, you know that Puget Sound is a pretty spiffy place. When we talk about quality of life, euphemistically, we're talking about resilience and beauty and opportunity. We really live probably in one of the prettiest places in the United States, and we still have a lot of wild places here. Puget Sound does encompass what is called the Salish Sea, so we occupy the southern half, which spans international borders with British Columbia. Tribal nations have stewarded these lands and waters and fished, hunted, cultivated, and gathered through the region since time immemorial. And the Sound is also a hub for food, economic development, tourism, export markets, and tech business development. Our challenge, however, is how to steward our wildness, which is juxtaposed against meteoric growth in an industrial economy. So the SILs support a lot of amazing work. We expand programs, which leads to additional business development, benefiting many local and regional businesses. And we're able to fund pilots and innovations, which dovetail very well with our regional ethos, and importantly, by demonstrating need in certain areas. And from identifying those needs, we are able to spur funding of permanent positions that further our shared objectives for resilience. In many ways, this funding source is really unique. It doesn't require a match. It often funds private sector work. Private sector businesses can't apply directly, but they can in partnership with eligible entities. It tends to encourage and accommodate innovation and pilots, which can lead to new discoveries. It builds long-term capacity in existing programs and is predicated on building capacity and connection through our integration work. And a really important part of our work, too, is understanding how people make decisions, what their values are, and using beyond education and outreach engagement and the use of social marketing, which is a very important field. So this is I'll just let you look at this slide for a minute, but this is a categorical breakdown of how we spend our money. We're dedicated to evidence-based work, which lends credibility and trust among our many partners and under the watchful eye of our funder, which is EPA. You'll see that we spend a tremendous amount of money on implementation and effectiveness monitoring. So, in the last few years, the Habitat and Stormwater SILs did some great work to advance ecosystem and water quality thinking into land use planning. And two examples were the Sound Choices checklist, and we can provide you with links to all these documents, and Commerce's Critical Areas Handbook. We also worked with the Puget Sound Regional Council to create an integrating stormwater into comprehensive plans and an additional planning guidance for stormwater parks. And this is just the guidance for integrating stormwater solutions into comp plans. And this was, really an important piece of work. Erica Harris from our advisory team, along with David Pater, who was with Commerce and is now with our advisory team, and Rebecca Brown wrote this and provided guidance to Erica. And it's a companion piece to the updated Sound Choices checklist, which was intended to provide a handy guide. And this, with our work in the missing middle legislation, advocated for balancing habitat and trees with housing, which is one of the ways we're addressing complex land use issues outside of funding. This influence in our relationship with regional planning groups, the Puget Sound Regional Council, and other partners is absolutely indispensable in creating a more balanced and holistic picture of integrated water and land use. This is a nod to a communities of practice model that we're still early in implementing. So we work to get project and program results into the communities of practice that will benefit from new learning approaches, research, and best management practices. People organize both socially and professionally in networks and communities of practice or groups of people that self-organize around a set of problems, passions, and practice to deepen their knowledge and expertise by interacting on an ongoing basis. And so they acquire, store, share, and update information. In our field, an example would be Jessica Knickerbocker, who works for the city of Tacoma, and she used to run a permeable pavement community of practice. So communities of practice are very different from casual groups that form and focus on group learning, innovation, expanding, and continually refining knowledge and helping each other. And this is one of the most underutilized outreach possibilities and help to funnel new research and best practices into existing practice areas. And so, in a way, partnering with land use planners, even though there's a lot of different types of people who work in planning, is a community of practice itself. In terms of land related issues, in addition to the tremendous store of projects and programs that we've invested in, which we could talk about another time and also give you information on, we've been grappling with what happens when land use planning is not integrated with stormwater and water planning, including obviously habitat. And both of our SILs are addressing integrated watershed planning and also did a huge amount of formative research to identify barriers to integration. So stay tuned for ongoing work. And so a couple of years ago,
Oh,
we
Heidi,
are
sorry, I
we
don't want to fully,
am I
but
over?
yeah.
Uh-oh, I'm off. Okay, well, we'll talk about integration later. Here's the last slide. APA has a water and planning network, so you should join because we're an APA chapter. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Heidi. It was a great overview. Um, that's great. Next up, we are going to turn it over to Ben Thompson from Department of Natural Resources to really set the context for why urban forests are important and why the work that you all do is so difficult. So go ahead,
Great. Can you all
Ben.
hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so again, my name is Ben Thompson. I'm with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Urban and Community Forestry Program. I am the program manager. I'm really pleased, as I mentioned in the chat, to see so many familiar names and faces on the call today. I just want to appreciate everything that you do, and especially a shout out to the rest of the team here, Rebecca and everyone else who helped put this together and who invited me along. I'm very grateful to be here. Obviously, it's an important topic with so many of you listening in today. So, I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible because I have 20 minutes to cover a lot of information. So I'm going to do my best to go through it. So for those of you not familiar with our program, we provide leadership to create self-sustaining urban and community forestry programs that preserve, plant, and manage forests and trees for public benefit and quality of life. We are a non-regulatory program. We don't tell anyone what to do or how to do it. I consider ourselves kind of a community's first phone call if there's an issue relating to trees or tree canopy in their city. Before you get elbows deep in a project, before you solicit for a contractor, like get in touch with our program, and we can help you bounce some ideas around or direct you to resources that might be useful to you. So in that way, I am not, nor is anyone on my team really equipped to solve anyone's problems or tell you exactly how we crack this tension between tree canopy and housing, but we're certainly an ally in the discussion. I don't know that I have to spend a whole lot of time on the importance of tree canopy. I think this group is pretty well versed in that. You wouldn't be on this call if you weren't there. But the bottom line is there are many, many benefits to urban tree canopy and healthy urban tree canopy, but there are also numerous threats to tree canopy, and urbanization is one of those threats. So I put this slide on here just to pose a kind of a rhetorical question, but there is no clear right answer to it. And it's like, is this representative of a good balance between tree canopy and development? And the answer is, given all of my experiences, like I don't actually know. Because it all depends on what your code language says, right? So if this is the best that you could do, if we removed, say, like if all of the sites that are occupied by homes were occupied by forests, as in the upper right corner of the slide, and all of those trees were removed, these houses and streets were put in, And then all of these street trees were planted back. Well, if all of those street trees are the best that your code allows you to implement, then this might be the best balance that you, as a city planner or a city official, are essentially allowed to strike here. So if the property owner had the right to develop and they submitted the plans and they went through the process and they followed all the rules and this is the best we can do, then there isn't anything anyone can argue about that with. The question is like, can we do better? How do we do better? What does better look like? Um, and that's kind of what I'm going to begin to explore a little bit more. So we all need trees, but we all need housing. There's definitely a housing shortage in Washington. Um, and but there's a lot of people who believe that an emphasis on building means that we're losing too much canopy or losing too many trees. Um, but what does that mean? I put the words too much in quotes because like what is too much? What is the right amount? How do we know what we need to do to instigate a better balance? How do we know what a better balance looks like? How do we know when we've arrived at what balance looks like? There are not easy questions or easy answers to these questions. So if it was a simple problem, we would have solved it long ago. We wouldn't be here today. So there are a lot of challenges in this problem. I've tried to do my best to summarize them. I'm sure I don't capture all of them in my presentation here, but I think probably the most formidable one is determining need. Like if there's a report that says the Puget Sound area needs X number of new housing units in the next 30 years or whatever the statistic is, like that's good information, but like what does it mean for me if I'm a planner in Federal Way or in Mukilteo, right? It's like I don't actually know how many housing units are quote needed in my city. I don't know what our obligation is to try to be a part of that solution. I don't necessarily know what types of housing units we need. I don't necessarily know where we need them. Do we need them all in one community or do we need them in a different community? Do we need them in one part of town or another part of town? Do we need them everywhere? Do we need all kinds? Do we need all types? There aren't really answers to these questions either. And folks that are dealing with this issue at the local level uh, they just have to respond to the development plans that come across their desks. So on the other side, if we're not talking about housing, we're talking about canopy. Like again, like how much canopy do we need? There is some kind of very early research on like what the right dose is, if you will. Like what's the right dose of greenery? What's the right amount of canopy? Quote, right. Again, putting these things in air quotes, like it's the benefits of trees can be quantified, but a lot of the quantification of the benefits is over an arc of time that is into the future. So we are sort of forecasting what the benefit will be into the future if we take one action or another today. And again, like what's the level of regulation and what type of regulation do we need in order to achieve the preferred future outcome? So another thing with an ordinance is really it's a tool that guides behavior toward a preferred outcome in the name of public benefit. And it's just how strong that tool is or how well it's equipped or who's wielding the tool and how they interpret it all make a difference. Any ordinance is only as effective as a community's willingness to regulate itself. If there isn't support for a particular ordinance or support for a particular action to take place in a particular way, then it won't exist in local ordinances unless it's required by state law. A lot of ordinances are reactive, they are incremental, and they often end up being cut and paste. So rather than saying like, we think that that X thing is going to happen in the future, and in order to prevent that, we are going to implement Y standards, and that will solve the problem. Like we're speculating into the future. So it's much easier to say, hey, whatever we were doing before isn't really working because we have this outcome that a lot of people agree is objectively negative. So let's amend the ordinance. Let's rewrite the rules so that we can prevent that from happening. And therefore, the ordinance is reactive. We react to the negative thing. We try to put in some what we hope are common sense measures to resolve that issue, and we move forward. But that only gets us incremental progress. And unlike things like engineering standards, there are no such quantifiable standards for tree ordinances or ordinances of any kind. So when we are looking to create something new, something different, there isn't a lot of appetite for creating something out of thin air. So we tend to just look around and say, what have other jurisdictions done? What kind of language are they using? And how can we use that or adapt that, or quite literally sometimes cut and paste it from their chapter into ours to make it work for us? I kind of mentioned this in different words, but any kind of new ordinance that you implement is speculative. It's like that's why there's so much discussion over the over ordinance updates. That's why there's so much community input and political process associated with these things, because we all have to come to some kind of a consensus that this is the right amount of new regulation or the right types of new regulation that we are all willing to try and experiment with, but kind of stand behind that basic idea that we're going to give this a shot. And anytime you pass an ordinance or amend an ordinance, like there's always going to be a scenario you didn't foresee, something that's not accounted for, and that's going to have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. You could also have different types of code requirements. You have requirements for parking, requirements for the building, and requirements for setbacks, and requirements for trees. And given the certain dimensions of the site, where it's located, who's building it, what kind of thing is being built, you're going to run into conflicts. I don't think this group is unfamiliar with that as being primarily planners, but then each time you run into one of those conflicts, we have to resolve that on a case-by-case basis, which of course takes time. There are lots of state laws and requirements, things like Forest Practices Act, Shoreline Management Act, Growth Management Act, critical areas, priority habitats and species, like the list goes on. And while they are hypothetically dictating what should happen, they are not prescribing how to do it. They are leaving that up to the local jurisdictions to figure out. And I may be incorrect in my assessment, but I still think that there is a lot of confusion or insecurity, or just like, I think there's a lot of jurisdictions that just don't really know how to do that well. So they do their best with it. They pass it up through the chain. They get buy-in from their managers and from their elected officials, and they go forward. They comply with the Department of Commerce. Commerce will approve comprehensive plans or not. So it's like we kind of all collectively muddle through a process and we get to the other side of it. But I think a lot of people don't really feel that confident in the process. That's just my guess, just my estimation. For those of you that are planners, this next slide is an expression of my empathy for you. It is not a judgment or a criticism. But many cities lack capacity or expertise for plan review and enforcement actions. Enforcement actions, I think it just tends to be a low priority for folks, for cities. On the plan review side of things, markets change. And so if the market conditions are favorable, you're going to get a ton of building permits and applications. And so if you staff up to accommodate that need, and then all of a sudden 2 years later the market shift and applications dry up, then you have people on staff without plans to review. So there's just this kind of ebb and flow that's always there, and I suspect that most jurisdictions keep their planning departments pretty lean, as to not overspend on staffing, and just hope that people can rally and pull together in the times when applications are heavy and thick. Planners are primarily generalists on purpose. Like, that's by design. It's a feature, not a bug. We need planners to be able to sort of sit at the table for the engineering conversations and the building conversations and the environmental conversations, enough to kind of pull the expertise from the other staff people in and the other experts and be able to kind of make sense of it and put it together. But we don't expect planners to be experts in any one of those topics. And that's why we have other experts. But while we have engineers and fire marshals and building inspectors, many cities don't have someone on staff whose job it is to review for environmental regulation. So it falls on the planner, who may or may not have that expertise. I'm not a builder, but I would say that building codes are fairly straightforward, whereas environmental codes require degrees of interpretation by an expert. And if you don't have that person on staff, then you're going to ask the developer to put that information in with a consultant that they have hired. And then it's at that point, if there is an expertise in-house, then all you can do as a planner is check the box to say they have provided the report. Oops. Oh, I guess that was the last piece of it. So, um, and again, I'm not an economist. I'm not a home builder. But building and construction is risky business, financially speaking. To be able to go buy the land, to be able to acquire the materials, to be able to support a full-time crew of people that will help you build those houses. That's a lot of upfront capital that's already invested before the development application is submitted. In the process of submitting that application, they've already paid an engineer, a site designer, an architect, whoever, to put those basic pieces together. Um, and as I mentioned, markets and costs can shift, and that affects the developers too. If they expect to build in one type of material and then the cost goes way up, that affects their calculations, right? The building process is going to take months or years. And so developers have to forecast their costs, quantify them to the best extent they can, and basically add a fudge factor for the rest of it, not exactly knowing what their costs might be. This means that their profit margins from project to project are going to vary. Sometimes those project margins could be small. Sometimes those projects could even end up in the negative if there's unforeseen circumstances, if costs balloon, what have you. Um, and again, keeping that full-time staff employed means that if there's a delay on your construction project, you need another construction project to send them to because you're not hiring them to do non-construction activities. So whatever that upfront cost is for one project, the developer has probably incurred that same level of upfront cost for 2 or 3 projects. And so, this isn't necessarily to say that I think we should all feel sorry for developers. I think it's just we have to be aware of what is on their shoulders. If you were walking around as a private business owner, millions of dollars in debt, and trying to wade through city policies and plan review, and you get a little frustrated along the way, like you might get frustrated too if you were shouldering that kind of burden. Um, I also will say that I'm primarily referring to the small-time home builders here. The large corporate construction companies, they have a larger investment portfolio. They have a bigger financial cushion. That's how they got to be a larger company. They probably can afford to take more of a financial hit on and take on more risk, but the smaller companies for sure are going to be more risk averse. And so therefore, anytime something new is introduced into the process that they haven't done before, like a new type of tree retention activity, that's going to make them very nervous because they don't know how to plan for it. They don't know how much it's going to cost, and they don't know how to factor it into their equations on how to price out that job. Uh, and another challenge is political support. We can't establish ordinances. We can't amend ordinances if there isn't political support. Political support ideally is informed by community level support. But also, even if we have the staff capacity and the staff expertise and we have good ordinances that we're relatively happy with and everyone's following the process, all it takes is for someone who is being regulated to go to a planning commission or a city council and say, I don't really like the way this is going. I'm going to seek a special exception. I want to do something different. And if everyone up the chain wants to value the needs of the applicant over the decisions made by staff, then it doesn't matter if we have the right ordinances or have the staff capacity and everyone's doing the right thing. So I think that this is definitely a challenge that folks working with local jurisdictions have experienced. Because really, at the end of the day, the level of political support that you're getting is the truest expression of community values. So I started with a slide that said tree canopy or housing, and I'm ending with a slide that says tree canopy and housing. And I think that that is one of the biggest things we have to think about is treating it like a zero-sum game. Now, granted, if you have a forested site and you remove 80% of those trees to put a new building in, it's really hard to get those trees back. It is hard to get that canopy planted somewhere else in a way that feels fair and feels equitable. But I think we have to figure out that like what that better balance looks like and treat this issue as like we can have trees and housing. And we do this all the time. We've just taken the things for granted. Like at some point, someone said, hey, What if we took all the stormwater that's coming off the Ship Canal Bridge that would typically go into the stormwater system and put it into the landscaping? Okay, that sounds great. And what if that landscaping was actually a public park and used for public amenity? Like, okay, let's do that too. At some point, someone said, hey, let's cut holes in the sidewalk and put trees in there. So there's all kinds of places and ways and examples of how we have thought creatively about how to meet multiple needs in small spaces in the urban landscape. Like the urban landscape is a high demand landscape with high expectations. We want it to do a lot of different things and provide a lot of different services. And so if we are continuing to look at the issue as it's housing or trees, I think that is not, I will contend that is not a helpful position. But we need to do a better job for ourselves of determining what a better balance looks like and how we're going to measure it, because we're going to have to measure it. It's nice to think that trees are good, trees provide a lot of benefits, it's the right thing to do. If we can't quantify it and we can't measure it, then it's going to be very hard to make the case. We need more research and best available science. Some of that is underway. Um, all of us have a shared obligation to improve our ordinances and standards based on the emerging science. That is its own challenge, though, too, because if you are a planner working in an underfunded, understaffed organization, and you're just trying to keep up with the basic workload of plans and permits you have to review, sometimes it feels a little bit insensitive to say, I want you to think about how we could do this better and create new systems on top of the ones you're already working in. There is not a lot of consistency between jurisdictions. Like a lot of times people, organizations, jurisdictions, they're regulating the same types of stuff, but they're measuring it in different ways. They're holding people to different standards. So some of the developers that I've worked with in the past had like community cheat sheets that would say, like, if I'm going to do a project in this city, here are the things that I'm going to have to be held to, versus now I'm going to go just over the line into a different jurisdiction. I have a different set of rules. So to the extent that we can get consistency, would be helpful. We can identify places and projects where we have achieved what feels like a better balance and reverse engineer those and say, what happened here? Why did this go this way? How was this cost effective for the developer in such a way that we got dense housing and tree canopy, or at least some agreed amount of tree canopy that we're happy with. We kind of have to be a little more entrepreneurial. We have to experiment and get greater support for new ideas and creativity. Again, I mentioned before, there's not a lot of tolerance for new ideas because we're all speculating that it's going to be the right new idea or that it's going to actually achieve the outcomes that we're after. And continued advocacy for greener communities. Some of the things that may be promising is just this idea of building up and not out. And I will say, I think a lot of zoning codes are just made up. It's not that they're not based on anything, but they're not based on anything. They're based on reactive feedback from the community. Someone built a loud and polluted manufacturing facility next to a hospital, and someone said maybe we shouldn't do that, right? So then we made rules in the zoning code that says you can't do that anymore. And so a lot of other zoning codes exist for similar reasons. So this idea that there's a cap on how high we can build in residential neighborhoods, I don't know if that's reasonable in all places. So maybe if we had smaller footprint buildings that went up higher, that had more space in the landscape for our tall, conical, single stem Douglas fir trees, maybe the tall building wouldn't look so imposing and wouldn't seem so out of place if there was more greenery in that landscape around it. Of course, there's like low impact development techniques, green soil water infrastructure. There's a lot of emerging technology on building design, building materials, green roofs, green designs. Are there ways that we can continue to minimize the amount of impervious surface to only what's absolutely necessary and maximize pervious surfaces? There's also this idea called the 330-300 rule. Again, I put rule in quotes because there isn't anything that says that it's a requirement. It's just a researcher who looked at various studies around tree canopy and came to a conclusion that every home should be able to see 3 trees out their window. Residential neighborhoods should have 30% canopy cover, and every person in a city should live within 300 meters of some kind of green space. So that's what that 330, 300 means. And so while I would say it isn't necessarily, hard and fast science that brought us there, it is just an example of how we are moving some ideas forward on the research front of things. And then I'll just end with a plug for our Evergreen Community Recognition Program. This was launched in the fall of 2024. It builds off of the requirements for the Tree City USA program. And while there are not development-specific criteria for the Evergreen Community Recognition Program, we're only asking that cities apply once, and then after that, to retain your participation in the program, we ask cities to meet with our team and set their own goals. And so if you set yourself a goal for an ordinance revision or an ordinance rewrite, that could be your project that helps keep you engaged in the Evergreen Community Program and fosters greater connection and communication and participation with our program. So I hope that does a reasonable enough job of setting the tone for the rest of the presentations today, and I thank you for the opportunity.
That was great, Ben. Thank you so much. Round of applause for Ben. And then next up, we have Max Lambert from the Nature Conservancy, who's going to share about some recent research on tree canopy and housing. So, Max, I see that your slide is coming up, and I say, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. Hey, all. I'm Max Lambert. I'm the science director for the Nature Conservancy. In my free time, I also spend a little time with the Thurston Housing Land Trust, so I have a little bit of nature and housing balance in my personal and professional world. I should have a lot of messages today in my presentation will echo some of what Ben was talking about, but from a kind of a different perspective. So the content today really got motivated by me and some of my colleagues a few years ago when Commerce put out this number that we need 1.1 million new housing units in Washington State over the next 20 years. And that really inspired some thinking with us about where and how that housing goes and how it's built could really shape a lot about how we care about nature and what we see with nature, both within our cities and urban growth areas and beyond it. And we were curious as we we're thinking about where that goes over the next 20 years, what's it look like over the past 10 years, and can we actually study the relationship between housing and tree cover change in recent years. And so today I'll kind of walk you through a study we published last year. This is with the colleagues here on this paper. I can put a link to this in a minute. From Washington Fish and Wildlife, using some really cool data sets that WDFW produced, as well as some data set from OFM. In the study, we looked at basically a decade of tree change and housing change across thousands of neighborhoods across Western Washington over about a 10-year period. Really some interesting patterns, and it gives us some insights to what we've been doing and kind of where we could go as we try and build out lots of housing in the coming years. So what I'll do here is I'll give you a little cartoon version of what we did, just to get giving you some context of what we're talking about. Then I'll give you some fake math to show you what it looks like, and then look at some real data so you can see actually what some neighborhoods around Western Washington have done with housing and trees over time. So one of the comments in the chat a minute ago was trees take space, housing takes space. And that's kind of the premise actually of our research. So if you have an imaginary forest or any plot of land with trees, there's kind of a constraint on how much of anything you can put in there without taking something out. So if you build any house, you're probably going to have to lose some degree of trees. If you build a bigger house, if that extra additional housing unit, you're going to take away more trees for the same unit of housing. Although it's a bigger housing footprint, more trees will be lost. An even bigger house like you might find in the exurbs means, again, only one housing unit, but even more trees lost because of the footprint of that house. As you think about adding more and more houses to a given area, you might be able to remove or add 3 housing units and lose the same amount of tree cover as if you only added 2 housing units, again, depending on the size of the housing footprint. And of course, if you go for super dense things like apartment complexes, townhomes, things like that, row houses, you can get lots of housing, lots of people in the same footprint, reduce tree cover loss at the same time. So there's kind of ways in which we can think about what housing density looks like in the relationship between maintaining or removing tree cover over time. So that's the general cartoon version of that. So now we'll get into some fake math. So this is kind of a picture of what our graph kind of looks like. I'll show you some data in a minute. The x-axis here is human density. I'll actually show you housing density in a minute. And the y-axis is tree cover. Given what I just showed you with the cartoon, as housing density increases in any plot of land, tree cover should go down to some rate. And the regression line here you see is kind of the average amount of tree cover for a given level of housing density or human density that we might expect. And if every one of these little dots here is a neighborhood, you can look at basically every neighborhood's housing density and tree canopy cover at the same time. And we might expect those dots, those neighborhoods, to kind of really cluster tightly to the average relationship between housing and trees in our region. The reality looks something more like this, a much messier relationship. So although in general, again, as you add housing to a given plot of land, you're going to lose tree cover, so you have a negative relationship there. There's a lot of variation. And what that means that for any given level of housing density in an area, you may have some that have very low amounts of tree cover and some that have very high amounts of tree cover. So how did those get to be that way? What are the mechanisms they did to get there? And what we can do is we can measure actually the difference between any given neighborhood's degree of housing density and tree cover and the average relationship for that regression line, the average for how much tree cover you expect for housing. So that's these red dotted lines, and those will be important to kind of keep an eye on. So what we did in our research was we labeled kind of all these dots above the line as bright spots, so places that have a high amount of tree cover for a given level of housing density. And those are places that we think did a better job, in Ben's kind of quotes there, for having high amounts of tree cover relative to housing density. The kind of corollary to that is the dim spots, so places that are below that average line that have relatively low amounts of tree cover for the same level of housing density as the dots above that line, right above them. So we can measure how bright or dim any given neighborhood is in Western Washington by measuring both housing density and tree cover at the same time. But we can also not only look at how much tree cover and housing a place has at one point in time, we can try and measure how much they change over time for both those variables, trees and housing. So we take this one dot here. In the first time we're looking at it, it is currently a dim spot. It's pretty far below that average line. Over some period of time, it can dim further and get reduced tree cover. In this case, it gains no human density or housing density. In a different situation, it could gain housing or humans and lose some tree cover, but not too much. And so that red line, although it's shifted to the right, is the same distance from the average line. So it gained housing, it lost some tree cover, but it's pretty much just as dim as it was just by gaining more housing. There are other ways that it might operate too. So you might have a place that actually gains housing, but doesn't lose any tree cover as it adds new housing to that given neighborhood. So that red vertical line there is a little shorter, which means it's closer to the average line. It may still be a dim spot, but the way in which it maintains some tree cover that it had while gaining housing allowed it to be a little brighter than it was in this nomenclature we created. And maybe an extreme version of a spot that was previously dim but gained so much housing, densified a lot, and kept its tree cover that it's now above average and above that line. So now it's actually a bright spot in the landscape because it has a relatively high amount of housing density and a relatively high amount of tree cover for how dense it is at that point in time. So that's kind of the fake math framework to give you a sense of what we actually did. And then we actually went out and measured using some cool data sets what happened over a 10-year period in Western Washington. So that's what you see here. This is a mess, and we'll go through it slowly, but it's kind of a fun mess. So the x-axis here is not people, it's actually housing density, so the number of housing units per hectare of land. Roughly 10 units per hectare is about 4 units per acre, if that gives you some context. And the y-axis here is the percent tree cover in a given neighborhood. Every one of these arrows is a single neighborhood or census block group in this case in Western Washington, from the densest part of an urban growth area to pretty far away exurbs. If it has a housing unit, we measured that census block group. The butt of the arrow is the amount of housing density and tree cover in that neighborhood in 2006, and the arrowhead is that same neighborhood roughly 10 years later, and its change in housing density and tree cover. So you can look at the way these arrows are moving across the graph here as how much any given neighborhood changed in housing density and tree cover at the same time over a 10-year period. So that's what we're looking at. And we can do is zoom in this big old cluster over here to the far left, which is kind of where most neighborhoods are in Western Washington. They're kind of in this low to medium level of housing density and get a better sense of what that looks like. So that's that mess. It's still pretty messy. Surprisingly, we actually removed a lot of arrows from this graph that had almost no change to make it easier to see, and it's still kind of messy. But you can look at the diversity of arrow directions and how much they're moving to get a sense of the change. And in general, most arrows are moving rightward, so a lot of them are gaining some degree of housing, although some do lose housing or don't change much at all. And in general, as they gain housing, they are losing some degree of tree cover. But how steep that arrow is tells you a little bit about how much trees are being lost as housing is being gained over a 10-year period. And those 5 colored arrows there are some case studies we're going to pop into in a second to give you a sense of what that actually looks like on the ground. This is a lot of data, pretty cool, unique data set that really there's no other comparison across the world for really looking at change in housing and trees at the same time in a given place. But a lot of variation here. So look at these. So everywhere from kind of King, Pierce, Snohomish counties all the way down to Clark County towards the Oregon border. Again, really all of Western Washington was in this data set. So this is one of my favorite examples to look at. This is a neighborhood in Roy in Pierce County. You can kind of see the faded version of where this is in that graph previously in the upper left corner. The purple you see here on the map, those are locations in this neighborhood where trees were lost over that 10-year period. Doesn't mean every tree was lost in that purple area, but that's a space in which tree was lost in that time frame. So this is outside of the urban growth area. It's a relatively rural space. But in our dimming to brightening concept, this is a space that went from being a bright spot to a dim spot. So at the beginning of our study period in 2006, this area had above average tree cover for how much housing was in the neighborhood, but it lost so much tree cover over that time space that it moved to become a below average tree cover for how much housing was there. So it was about roughly a 10% increase in housing, which is like maybe 15 to 20 housing units across this area, but it lost a third of its tree cover over that same 10-year time frame. So you gained kind of a small number of relatively large houses, but lost quite a bit of tree cover over this time frame. This is probably hundreds of acres of tree cover lost for a small amount of housing gain. So a bright to dim transition over 10 years. This is a spot kind of in Belltown, downtown Seattle area. Pretty interesting spot. It was previously a dim spot when we started, and it remained a dim spot over a 10-year period. But it's an interesting place because it had a 6-fold increase in housing density, in large part because it transformed several big parking lots into apartment complexes. So tree cover over the same time frame, relatively unchanged. The caveat to that is that there's almost no trees to lose over the time frame. This place is about 3% tree cover. So we're really putting people with this housing into a pretty impacted impervious surface sort of landscape neighborhood. Not surprising, there's not a lot of trees there, but that is kind of a trade-off of you can densify areas like this without losing tree cover, but the people aren't going to really be experiencing a lot of tree cover when they're living there. That's an interesting example. Was dim and remained dim over time. This is other space that's interesting as a kind of a dim to dim comparison. So also was a dim spot, so below average tree cover for how much housing was there beforehand, and remained dim, but became quite a bit brighter. It brightened quite a bit over time. Tripled the amount of housing in this particular area. And the tree cover was largely unchanged. So there's more tree cover here, maybe roughly 25% tree cover across the whole neighborhood at the beginning of the study, and lost maybe 2% of that over the time frame. Again, the purple blotches there, places where a little bit of tree cover was lost. It wasn't tree cover in the whole purple that was lost. But this is actually kind of an interesting spot. So this neighbor here is actually just within the urban growth area, former ag land, so it's kind of barely on conversion to housing for the most part. Minimal tree loss, not a lot of tree cover there in the first place. But an interesting way to think about how and where we add housing, given the landscapes we have and the kind of housing you want to build within urban growth areas. And I'll say this one's interesting because it's a mixture of single family houses, middle housing, and some denser housing was all built into this landscape over that 10-year period. And this is kind of one of our favorite little unicorn spots. This is in Mill Creek in Snohomish County. This is one of the few spots that was a dim spot or a below average canopy cover for how much housing was there that transitioned to have above average canopy cover for how much housing was there over that 10-year period. So a 2.5 times increase in housing and a relatively light change in tree cover. Again, the purple blotches there, some trees were lost, but not too much. It wasn't the entire purple that was lost. And this is an interesting spot because it took some office buildings, some parking lots, and redeveloped those and add some infill housing to create some denser housing. Again, densifying with pretty minimal tree cover loss. So a very rare spot where we actually see a place gaining housing with minimal tree cover loss. I'll touch on this for just a hot second, but this is a very one of the few places we have that's really high density, so several hundred housing units per hectare. Again, in Seattle. And this was originally a bright spot, so very high housing density and some pretty good tree cover actually. And it remained bright, didn't really lose tree cover, almost doubled housing by adding more apartments in this time frame. But it does show, as you can kind of see from this arrow here, kind of a limit on how much brighter you can get. So once you're already super dense, all you can really do is add more housing and try not to lose too much tree cover at some point in time. So I'll kind of button up the talk at this point in time with some lessons learned from this data. What we did show with our study of housing and trees over a 10-year period is that tree loss is not inevitable with housing gain. There are ways to maintain tree cover, at least to some degree, although that's not the normal trend. And that housing gain, as you're doing that, is not necessarily created equal. Adding a large single family house is not the same thing as adding a duplex, it's not the same thing as adding an apartment complex. With respects to impact on tree canopy, that's probably obvious, but we actually see that bear out in the data set across the region. This is an interesting takeaway. You heard Ben say something very similar, that tree planting really can't replace tree loss. It's actually kind of an interesting constraint on our analysis is that we can't really easily measure tree growth over 10-year periods because trees grow slowly. So it was really hard for us to see any impacts of tree planting over that time frame. So really can measure is trees that aren't lost and trees that are lost over that time frame. Again, really emphasizing the value of tree retention as much as possible when adding housing. And this little concept we created for bright and dim spots and brightening and dimming doesn't really matter whether you're talking about super dense areas in the middle of cities or kind of more rural urban areas or the fringes within an urban growth area. You can really apply the same sort of concept, the same relatively simple math to track the joint changes in housing and trees in your neighborhoods as you're thinking about them. And get a sense of whether you're adding more housing and keeping as much tree cover as possible over time. And to kind of wind down, one of the cool things from this, we're actually able to look at the differences in brightening and dimming within urban growth areas and beyond urban growth areas. And pretty much all neighborhoods that showed some degree of brightening over that 10-year period were within urban growth areas. And really the most stark dimming or places that lost the most tree cover for how little housing they gained were outside of urban growth areas. That makes sense given the Growth Management Act, but it's kind of nice to see that bear out in the data as well. In this brightening and dimming framework we were putting together, what's really interesting is that the housing gain really can overwhelm tree loss. So if you add so much housing to a given area, the math allows you to kind of tolerate some degree of tree loss because it's the relative amounts of housing and trees are in some ways beneficial there. And the opposite is also true that if you lose too much trees, even if you gain some housing, it's probably going to cause some damage to the math on where you are in the brightening and dimming world. So we think this bright spot, dim spot, brightening and dimming framework gives us some kind of language to work with for thinking about how we add housing and try to retain as much tree cover as possible as we do that. With that, I look forward to the conversation later on about how we try to strategically add housing as fast and thoughtfully as possible with respect to keeping our trees.
Wow, that was really great, Max. Thank you for that. We are going to take a 5-minute break here, so I'm going to encourage folks to come back. It's wow, brain 4:01. We're going to come back at 4:01 and get started again, but I'd also really encourage people to look at the chat. There's a lot going on, a lot of great questions and conversation. And then we'll see you in 5. Thank you. Eileen, if you want to. Okay, everybody, I hope that you're making your way back from the break. We've got two more presentations this afternoon. So next we'll hear from Eileen Ettinger with the Nature Conservancy to share about some work that she's doing in Tacoma.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, my name is Eileen Ettinger. I'm an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy along with Max, and I'm really excited to share about a research project we have ongoing in Tacoma called Greening Research in Tacoma. I'm going to start by giving you our take-home messages, so you can keep your eye out for support for some of these or me emphasizing these throughout the talk. But I think you'll see through some of the research that we're talking that trees can be climate resilience infrastructure. We can see them as climate resilience infrastructure in our region because, especially with climate change, they can improve human well-being. But a challenge associated with this is that trees are inequitably distributed, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But all of these things together mean that really meeting the housing and tree canopy goals that you've heard, reiterated in the previous two talks already, it will require collaboration within communities. So excited to dive into this in a bit more detail and share more about our research. Just setting the context for this, of course, we're living in an era of climate change. Temperatures in the Seattle-Tacoma area, for example, have increased by more than 50% in the last 20 or so years. Along with these rising temperatures, we're also seeing changes in air quality. So increased smoke and other drivers of air quality are leading to worse, often declining air quality in cities in our region. But these problems, we do have some solutions that are readily available. For example, we know that trees can help address both of these problems. In addition, trees offer a number of other benefits to people. You've already heard about many of these. So in addition to cooling spaces and helping to clean the air, there's a lot of research out there suggesting that trees can also increase human well-being in a variety of ways, including reducing stress, supporting long-term health, helping people get outside and get more active. So there's a number of different ways that trees can benefit people in our communities in Washington. And so a challenge, though, with this is that although we know that there are these clear benefits that trees can have, especially in urban areas, there's variation in tree cover across Western Washington municipalities as well as within them. So this is a graph showing some of the variation in tree cover across some of our municipalities in Western Washington, right from Tacoma at 20% up to Bothell at 45%. So variation across cities, but also within them. And one thing also that we know about this variation in tree cover is that it tends to be associated with factors like income. So trees are not equitably distributed within cities. We see this pattern. This was a study that was done by researchers at the Nature Conservancy across municipalities in the US. So not just in Washington, but across the US. This similar pattern has been documented around the world, really, but that with higher tree cover, we often see higher income. So there's this clear association that's been documented in a number of different ways. The causes behind this association are multivariate and often rooted in systemic racism and history and a variety of factors. But it is an association that's been well documented and certainly a challenge for addressing housing and tree cover needs. So there is a lot of research looking at both of these things, looking at tree cover, looking at heat and air quality associated with tree cover. Much of the research that's out there is sort of correlative. So similar to this kind of graph, like looking at using zoomed out data sets or remote sensed data that's available, documenting some of these associations. What we really don't have a good understanding of, though, or much research to sort of base our decision making on, is on the ground data within communities. For example, if we look at a community that currently has low tree cover and we try to add more trees, how do community members experience that? What do people notice? What do people experience? We don't have much data on that. And that's a real need if we want to address housing and tree cover needs in our region. And one reason why there's not a lot of research out there is that it's hard to do. So there's a real need for this collaborative approach to collecting on the ground data in communities about how tree cover and temperature and air quality and other human health factors are related, especially as temperatures warm. And that's exactly what our research aims to do. So our research project is called Greening Research in Tacoma. And it's a highly collaborative project spanning community-based organizations like the Asia Pacific Cultural Center and Tacoma Tree Foundation, along with the City of Tacoma, Urban Forestry, the Nature Conservancy of Washington, and the University of Washington. And so this project, we're aiming to build knowledge and understanding about human well-being and how it intersects with increased greening in South Tacoma and other greening relationships throughout Tacoma. And we're using a community-engaged research approach that's really critical to the way we're doing the work. So I'm going to share some of the research is ongoing, but I'm going to share some of our research, and unfortunately I don't have time to talk about it in great detail, but we'll touch on some of the major themes. And before I get into that, just sort of why are we doing this work in Tacoma and how did it come about? So as I already mentioned, Tacoma is one of the communities in Western Washington or the Puget Sound region with the lowest assessed tree cover. You can see it's got about 20% tree cover. So it's a city that would like to have more trees. It has goals of achieving higher tree cover. But also within the city, there's variation in equity relationships similar to those larger scale patterns that we've already talked about. So higher opportunity neighborhoods have about 15% more tree cover than lower opportunity neighborhoods in the city. For those of you not in Tacoma, you might be able to look at these sorts of relationships within your municipality by, this is often summarized through a tree equity score. American Forest has created this tree equity score tool. So if you're not familiar with this, I would encourage you to check it out and look at your community's tree equity and how it varies across the municipality. But so, and one of the reasons this project came about in this context of Tacoma as a low tree cover city already is the city had an opportunity that presented itself. The Nature Conservancy has been working in partnership with the city urban forestry program for quite a while. And an opportunity came up where we have the chance to document, collect some data before a large scale tree planting event and then after. And this is a rare opportunity that we don't often have to actually provide some evidence about how people are experiencing these sorts of changes. And so Tacoma had a large green stormwater infrastructure project planned for this region highlighted in orange in Tacoma. And this was sort of our focal area around which we designed our research, which is community focused, partly because that allows us to gather knowledge and improve our understanding, but also build awareness about some of these issues at the same time. And so our goal with this is to understand how people are experiencing both heat, air quality, and greening. And so we installed temperature loggers throughout the Tacoma Mall area where this tree planting event or tree planting green infrastructure project is planned. And we've been measuring temperature there for several years now and quantifying relationships between tree cover and heat. And we've expanded recently to quantifying relationships between tree cover and air quality, and also simultaneously doing some qualitative and quantitative surveys to understand how people are experiencing these changes. And so just some of the patterns that we've seen and what we've been documenting through this research so far. One major thing we've documented is, perhaps not surprisingly, but more tree cover is associated with lower temperatures. And the thing that we get, though, by doing this on the ground in a really detailed way is something we get some knowledge that I think I wasn't sure what we would find. And one thing is we weren't sure what this relationship between temperature on the y-axis here versus canopy cover or the amount of trees on the x-axis, we weren't sure what that would look like. Other people have suggested it might be sort of a threshold relationship where you have to get to a certain number, a certain amount of tree cover before you see the benefits on or the beneficial impacts on temperature. Whereas what we found was actually a linear relationship. So every bit of added tree cover helps reduce heat stress, helps reduce the impacts of high temperatures. So that's a pretty powerful thing to know, that adding trees helps. Every little bit helps. We don't need to get to a certain threshold. The other thing that was surprising to me that we found so far is like pretty dramatic variation within one neighborhood, and it was associated with tree cover. But so within one neighborhood at any given time, we found temperatures could vary by about 4.6 degrees Fahrenheit on average, but up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And what this means is that if you listen to a weather forecast or you're making decisions on what your activities might be during the day based on, for example, a weather forecast, that's going to give you an average temperature, but what you actually might be experiencing, what construction workers might be experiencing when they're out doing their job might actually be much higher than what's expected. And so this has really important human health implications and is something that's important to be aware of, especially in the context of human health and heat stress. And we did find that the probability of exceeding high heat thresholds, such as those that are, regulatory through OSHA and other occupational heat regulations, the probability of exceeding those thresholds was related to tree canopy cover. So if you have more trees, you're less likely to exceed those dangerous heat thresholds, which is really important for outdoor workers. And through this work and through some of the surveys that we did and community engagement, we heard interest not only in heat stress, but also in understanding air quality. There are a lot of concerns with air quality in the neighborhood. And so as a result of that, we expanded our environmental monitoring in Tacoma to also include air quality monitors. So you can see here, there's a number of purple air loggers throughout the city that we've installed and others have installed. And this research is really preliminary, but what we've found so far is that in 2025, mostly air quality was pretty good in the neighborhood where we've been monitoring it, but you can see a number of spikes. This is from August to November, where air quality really did exceed those thresholds for healthy air that Puget Sound Clean Air has designated. And those patterns of poor air quality that can occur in Tacoma, perhaps not surprisingly, align with other patterns of environmental inequities in Tacoma. So just as we tend to see lower tree cover and higher heat in South Tacoma, we also tend to see worse air quality. These red dots versus the green dots are poor air quality. And so we definitely have been seeing so far in our analyses relationships between air quality that are consistent with other patterns of environmental inequities in Tacoma. PM 2.5 is fine particulate matter, that so higher PM 2.5 is worse air quality. Moving on now to some of the I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the human well-being surveys that we've been doing and what we found so far. So what are people saying about some of these dynamics and what they're experiencing? And we're still working on the pre and post tree planting quantitative human well-being surveys, but we can share some of the qualitative surveys and what people have been sharing with us about their perspectives of urban tree benefits and drawbacks, challenges that people see. So members of the community in South Tacoma are definitely talked about temperature regulation as being and benefit of trees, as well as aesthetics and human and just well-being and mental health as well. They also did notice talk about connections between trees and air quality or clean air. So people are recognizing and aware of these relationships between tree cover, urban trees, and human health benefits such as temperature regulation and air quality. People did talk about some drawbacks or challenges that they see with urban trees, however, some just being simple maintenance and damage to utilities or sidewalks, but also just costs related to trees and safety. And then people also did talk about their awareness of heat impacts and what they're experiencing and how they might be addressing those challenges in the future. So people have talked about doing things like purchasing an air conditioning unit, which they maybe haven't done in the past, closing their blinds and curtains, or even using just frozen towels or ice packs. But they also did talk about seeking shade. And so this is one way that people are seeing trees as a way that they can help address heat and climate impacts. So all of this sort of snapshot from our research so far just sort of highlights, again, a theme that you've been hearing is that we know we need housing, but we also need trees along with this. And so this is especially true as communities experience higher temperatures and worsening air pollution associated with climate change. And trees can have real and quantifiable effects on temperature and air quality. We're working on doing that quantification in our region. So what does it mean in our region specifically? But I think existing inequities in heat stress and air quality could potentially have the potential to be exacerbated when housing is added. So it's important to be aware of this context and think about how we can integrate trees as part of our climate change and comprehensive planning to ensure that we're not exacerbating some existing inequities. The other thing this work has highlighted so far is really that it is an all hands on deck situation. It requires collaboration across multiple, sectors and community types. This is really the sort of thing that's going to require it's going to require a lot of working together and collaboration to get both the trees and the housing that we know we need in our region. So that's it for me. I'll leave my email up there. Looking forward to hearing Mike's talk so you can keep hearing about Tacoma.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. And you've just introduced the next talk, so that's great. It's all just y'all are doing such great work. The next on our last speaker here, last but not least, is Mike Carey from the city of Tacoma. And so we can continue hearing about what's going on in Tacoma and maybe how we're addressing some of these challenges that I'm seeing that we're hearing about and seeing in the chat. So take it away, Mike.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. Once again, Mike Carey, the Urban Forest Program Manager here with the City of Tacoma. Can you see my screen okay? Sharon, all right? Great. So I actually just wanted to sit with a moment just in gratitude for the tremendous work that my colleagues who have just presented have been doing for a long time in the industry, just by helping to support a lot of the work that I think intuitively we all know is important. We know that trees are great for our communities, but actually backing that with some of the science that you just heard is really important in terms of moving the industry forward. And I also want to sit with a moment of gratitude I'm here to present today like a very small snippet of a huge project that lasted multiple years to kind of reconfigure Tacoma's zoning codes and policies around trees and development. But I am really, again, just one player in this process that really involved dozens of people. And I'm presenting today a little snippet of a presentation that was an hour long, presented at the APA Washington conference back in October. And just a quick shout out to that a lot of the graphics that you'll see in this presentation were generated by our consultant team at Methune, who did a tremendous job of supporting us through this work. So you just heard Ben posing the question about what is the right balance, about how can we balance regulations for trees and housing. You heard Max talk about the science and how it's demonstrated that canopy loss while increasing housing is not inevitable. Eileen has demonstrated how vital trees are as public health infrastructure and also mentioned, by way of example, that Tacoma has the lowest tree canopy in the Puget Sound region. So maybe we have the most to gain by really getting our stuff figured out with tree regulations and housing. And I'm here to talk briefly about how development regulations for Tacoma, we're hoping can help facilitate trees and housing coexisting together in hopes that using Max terminology, we might become a bright spot in the future. Okay, so navigating on. Okay, I think you've all seen this already before multiple times. This dichotomy of housing or trees. I'm just going to take it head on. Most times when I engage in discussions about tree policy and zoning, there's this binary choice that's been presented, right? So, if you will, follow me for a moment. A lot of the development community that we interact with, when they talk about what tree people want, they'll often present this scenario that you're seeing on this slide, right? It's we want to preserve the forest and then kind of shoehorn in these tiny houses. It's kind of this the again dichotomy that is presented. It's housing or trees. When you talk to the tree community, a lot of tree people think developers want something that's kind of devoid of really meaningful vegetation, that it's kind of on the fringes of development, kind of filling in some of the blank spaces. But I think if you sit with some people and you actually have conversations about what are the needs, what do they actually want, you'll come to realize that a lot of people meet in a middle ground of what most people actually want is diversity of housing choices. It's making sure that within that diversity of housing choices, we can also have diversity of green infrastructure, that we can be surrounded by these natural resources that help with healthy, livable communities while meeting our housing demands. And so that's kind of the premise of a lot of the work that we took on in Tacoma when we reconfigured our zoning policies and codes, is assuming the best intentions, assuming that we were all on the same common ground of wanting the environment that has more housing choices to support our population demands, but then also a green future for Tacoma. Okay, I'm not going to say it again. It's been said 10 times. You can read it on the slide. Alrighty. So I wanted to focus just briefly on our process that we went through to look at, again, our priorities for Tacoma and how we tackled this issue of zoning code updates in response to the bill that was passed 1110 about missing middle housing. I won't take a whole lot of time talking about the missing middle housing bill. Hopefully, folks on this call are familiar with it. But if you're not, you should give it a read to talk or to learn a little bit more about the premise for a lot of communities tackling housing and trees at the same time. So Tacoma's approach started with looking and doing an audit for our priorities. We have, over many years, adopted a lot of council policy, community policy around affordable housing. At the same time, we have often developed a lot of policy around green infrastructure and climate change infrastructure. And we, at this moment in time, had the opportunity to evaluate all of those policies together and not kind of, sometimes we tend to develop policies in a vacuum and not necessarily understand how they might influence one another. And this really allowed us to take a step back and again, look at what does it mean to, at the end of the day, have these policies that hopefully are mutually supportive and not exclusive of one another. Right. The engagement process that we used. I'm not going to belabor the point. This is a multi-year effort. We went to every community in Tacoma and held public meetings. Lots of facilitated discussions around specific issues that we wanted to dig into, like our housing growth vision, what amenities you might expect to see or want to see with growth in your community. How can missing middle housing complement existing neighborhoods and not take away from neighborhood character? That was a huge area of focus for our discussions. And then how can we keep housing affordable? Actually, just on that note, things that popped to the top of those lists every single time came down to thinking about building retention as a good opportunity to preserve and cherish existing neighborhood character, and then also wanting to not just preserve, but also increase neighborhood green spaces. Okay, so with that, I wanted to give some brief context about the city of Tacoma's situation in terms of how our low density residential zones were set up. So we essentially converted everything that used to be single family residential, which was about half of the city's land area, into these new land use intensities we call urban residential zones. UR1, 2, and 3, based on the intensity of use. So you can see here the UR1 zones, and that kind of light yellow color is the lowest intensity of use, all the way up to the UR3, which is a medium intensity zone, which allows for a mix of building and housing types, including multiplexes. Through these exercises, we again looked at the top things that were ranked through all of our community engagement processes and tried to actually demonstrate and model on a site how do all these things interplay, right? So how can we increase building height to maybe get other things like providing for larger yard spaces? If we don't have on-site parking requirements, it also allows for us to have other things like larger yard spaces and trees. I'm not going to go through all these scenarios, but there was a ton of modeling that was done just to figure out how can we piece together all of these different priorities in a way that was beneficial of each other and not exclusive. I want to present for a moment a term that we coined early on in this process, which was really helpful for us as we talked to everybody about these zoning code changes. And I will just say trees are essential public infrastructure. I hope most of you on the call can say that and mean it as well. I imagine I'm in good audience here. But changing the script about trees not just being an object of beauty in our community to trees being part of our essential urban fabric, that urban infrastructure really helped to start talking meaningfully about the balance between tree infrastructure and other essential infrastructure like utilities and other on-site amenities as well. One of the early practices that we took on when we were developing the code options for the city of Tacoma was to think through the mitigation hierarchy sequence. And essentially, what we were trying to figure out is how can we allow for development to happen while hopefully not diminishing the benefits of existing tree canopy. So if you're not familiar with the mitigation hierarchy concept, it was essentially coined through critical areas regulations to figure out how can you allow for intervention to happen like development, but then again, not lose some of the ecosystem services that those natural spaces provide. On the kind of graph here, on the far left, you can see the tree canopy benefits today, kind of on that graph. That's what that dark blue is trying to represent. The next column over is like the next priority, that if you're going to have to do some development on site, you want to start with avoidance. You want to try to place infrastructure and construction activities away from trees to avoid impacts to them, to again, between that and then saving the trees on site entirely, kind of have that same cumulative benefit that the trees provide. The next bar over shows not just avoidance, but also if you have to start interacting with trees, trying to reduce the intensity or extent of your impacts. So maybe doing some structural pruning around the trees to allow for new building facades to go next to them. Or if you have to do some pruning to allow for new pathways, thinking through new technologies about like soil structures to save root systems if you can, but it's trying to minimize that impact to again get that same net benefit. Moving on down the hierarchy here, if you have to impact trees through removal, how might you restore that same benefit back on site is a really important thing to consider. And if you cannot do it back on site, thinking about how you can get off-site mitigation satisfied as well. So translating that mitigation hierarchy into development regulations was really important for us conceptually to understand. And so here are just some examples of tools that the city of Tacoma put in our toolbox in our zoning code to address all of those things that I just mentioned. So kind of in the avoidance category, we talked a lot about requiring, right? So how can we require placement of infrastructure and construction activities to be away from trees to preserve them where appropriate? Having tree retention protection requirements, again, like these standards that we accept to say, is a tree so big or so special that it should outright be preserved? And then what was really, really important, and again, when we're discussing mutual priorities for land, which is land in general is a pretty sacred space, right? There's a huge competition for the same amount of area. We're not getting any new land anytime soon. Providing protection incentives and flexibility standards is really important to have in your code as well, to not just require outright tree protection, but to then provide flexibility in other ways to incentivize it. In the minimization category, we went with the tree credit system here, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And then with that tree credit system, providing some allowances if you're above and beyond kind of your share of tree credits for the community. And then setting some canopy loss fees. So if you do have to have some level of impact, paying for that in mitigation funds that then can go to offset those impacts elsewhere. And the restoration category or rehabilitation category, tree planting to achieve minimum tree credits per lot. So if you again have to remove, planting back to mitigate for what you've taken away. And then we really spent a lot of time focusing on right tree, right place standards and tree health standards to ensure long-term success of whatever trees do get planted. And then again, kind of at the last resort here in the mitigation hierarchy, if you can't mitigate back on site, then using tree banks off site are an appropriate method for us, and then also providing for an in lieu fee structure. So really quickly, I wanted to talk about the tree credit concept that we developed for Tacoma. Um, so going back to those urban residential land uses, based on the intensity of use, we kind of set this tree credit requirement for a site. So if you come in for a development permit and your development is passing a threshold where now you require compliance with the tree credits, the credit is based on the percent of area of your lot. And you can get the credits met for your development based on preservation. So if you preserve existing trees on site, you get higher credit ratios than if you plant new trees. But then also it allows for opportunities for reliefs from other standards. And I'll go through those here in just a second. And then if you don't have existing trees on site to preserve, you also get credit for planting. So you may be required to plant trees, and depending on the size of maturity of those trees that you plant, you get different credit ratios. So it could be that your entire development only needs to plant one large species of tree and you meet your credits no problem. Again, I mentioned that we have kind of different band intensities of use in Tacoma, the urban residential 1, 2, and 3. And we also realize that with those different intensities of use, there's potentially less space available to physically plant trees, or you might be adding more infrastructure to meet your maximum allowable units that might take away from some tree preservation opportunities. And so we have those tree credit requirements banded based on, again, that intensity of use of the UR1, 2, and 3. And then I also really wanted to focus on, again, in urban communities, there's lots of priorities for space and use. And we really focused our system on allowing for reductions for bonuses, right? Because we're also trying to incentivize things like affordable housing or building retention or providing for home ownership opportunities that are not necessarily rental opportunities. And so when we have these other priorities, it was important for us to kind of offset or lower some of those tree canopy requirements to incentivize some of those other priorities. And then again, when there are tree credit fees, right? So if you're not able to meet your tree credit requirement on site, you can essentially buy down that credit, but there's a floor. You cannot go past the 10% of a lot area floor because we realize even though you might be able to offset some of those requirements based on those other incentives we're supporting, we still think that you should host at least a little bit of tree canopy on site for some of those community benefits. Okay, so again, looking a little bit more into the tree credit concept, I had mentioned that for existing trees, they're valued at a higher ratio than newly planted trees. And you can see that in this little graph here, or this table here. Trees that you retain that are less than 6 inches might be valued at 50 credits per inch of diameter of the trunk. But to incentivize really big tree retention, which we understand is just going to make site constraints so much harder, we provided a lot more credits per inch for those larger diameter trees. So over on the far right, you can see if you're saving a tree in excess of 24 inches in diameter, which is a pretty big tree, it's worth 125 credits per inch. And so you can save one large tree on your site and pretty much meet the minimum requirements for tree credits for a residential use. Again, talking a little bit about tree retention requirements. And so in Tacoma, again, the community really strongly supported a value system of tree retention being a requirement. And for us, it's kind of this tiered requirement for preservation based on the size of the tree. So for us, trees less than 6 inches are not regulated for retention. Trees between 6 and 18 inches, they can be removed. But any removal that brings an on-site tree credit below that minimum that I had mentioned is subject to a canopy loss fee, which means, again, that fee is collected that gets used to mitigate for that loss elsewhere. Trees between 18 and 24 inches can be removed, again, subject to a canopy loss fee. Um, but again, it's this kind of special category where you have to really demonstrate that it's necessary to remove it to meet some of the other requirements like your unit size and other things too. And then trees in excess of 24 inches in diameter cannot be removed. There are some specific exemptions in there. If you really want to get into it, I'm happy to tell you what those are. But in efforts of time right now, I'm going to move on for now. Just know that if it's over 24 inches, it's going to be really hard to remove in Tacoma. I also wanted to focus on the importance of flexibility in your standards. So if you want to save trees through development, you also have to evaluate what the other standards are that you have on your site, and if there's opportunity to be flexible with those to provide for more opportunity to save trees. And some of the ones that we landed on in Tacoma are height flexibility standards, right? So in certain residential areas of Tacoma, you are restricted on how tall your building can be. And we provide relief from that if you are retaining trees. So you can actually go up in height. Front and rear setbacks as well get some relief if you are retaining trees, as well as side setbacks, and then parking as well. And actually, there's a state regulation that also set the tone for that, that if on-site parking would require removal of trees, that you actually can waive those off-street parking requirements entirely, which was great. Okay, so the concept here is not housing growth or tree growth, it's how might we grow together. We mentioned before that nothing in the urban environment happens in a vacuum. It's really important to identify your community's ethos and values around housing and green amenities like trees and other infrastructure, and to listen to those community views and competing priorities. And by listening, you might be able to identify ways to accommodate with flexibility in development standards or incentives or other allowances to meet or ease the stress on multiple competing needs. And then just kind of to wrap it up here, being conscious of time again, it's also really important, I will say this time and time again for the development community, not just having code, but actually having supplemental materials that can help people navigate the code in a meaningful way. So in Tacoma, we simultaneously developed this urban residential districts design standards, which kind of takes the legality of our code and breaks it down based on different site use intensities, different housing typologies, and again, kind of those design standards. And we co-evolved that with our urban forest manual. That's the accompaniment document that talks about if you're doing all these things for on-site design and development standards, how is the urban forest responsive to that? And what are your tree requirements to support that as well? Okay, I think hopefully I made it in my time. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was great. I will say that you had 8 seconds left, so perfect timing. Folks, we were going to do kind of a round of breakout rooms, but I think in the interest of time and the extent of conversation in in the chat here, I think that we we'll skip the we'll relieve you of this terror of going into a breakout room, and we are just going to have a conversation here with folks. So if there's any questions that folks like to ask, I'll encourage you to raise your hand. But we can also pull from the um, the the questions in the chat as well. Anne, yes, go ahead.
Yes. There's a bill in the legislature now. I believe it's 2273. I may have the wrong number. It's sponsored by Davina Dewar, and it's establishing tree banks. And she's run this bill for about 4 years. I haven't looked to see if it made it through this first cutoff. But I know it involves Department of Commerce and the DNR. So I guess if there's someone from DNR, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this bill.
Yeah, I can respond to that. So yeah, you're correct. The bill has been through the legislature for the last four. This is its fourth consecutive session. I would say that, from its original draft, it's made a lot of progress. Um, I I think I guess like my firm opinion on it is that it's an oversimplification of the issue. Like it's proposing a solution based on an oversimplification of the housing and tree friction issue. And for those of you not familiar, I'll just give you like as quick a synopsis as I can. But basically, it says that we can designate specific areas, parcels of land, or planting locations where if a developer cannot meet canopy retention requirements, that they could pay a fee in lieu for trees to be planted in these very like specific areas. And so I think um, it would be there's a lot of work behind that. We would first have to identify, we'd basically have to do a statewide land cover analysis to say like where are these locations where trees could be planted. Um, and then I think there's also a need for like a legal analysis. Like, can a local jurisdiction receive revenue from a developer who's doing work in their jurisdiction and then disperse those funds to have trees planted outside the city limits someplace, if in fact that location was outside city limits? Um, and while it does kind of theoretically balance tree canopy, it doesn't do it where the benefit is lost. Like the benefit would be gained in a site where it's lost in a different location. So, uh, it also would require like finding out, well, who's going to manage these locations where trees are getting planted to ensure that the trees actually survive, and who's going to make the decisions about what trees get planted in what locations. And then how do you make those determinations in sort of like a reasonable way? And like who owns these properties? Is it all state land? Are they going to be owned by nonprofits and state and churches and schools and park districts, and who knows, right? So there's a lot of unanswered questions that we'd have to answer those questions before we could begin to implement something like that. And the bill doesn't, in my view, doesn't really address those challenges.
I will just add that I've testified against this bill several times now. And in Mike's presentation, he talked about those tree banks as being sort of a last resort, which I would agree with. And the unfortunate thing about this bill is it sort of makes it the centerpiece instead of the last resort. So again, like Ben said, sort of simplifies the situation in a way that I don't think is going to be very helpful for people. So I believe it is dead this session, but she's brought it for 4 sessions, so I don't imagine we've seen the end of it.
My other comment on that bill, though, has been that if it did pass, we like the tree banking thing, maybe it would work and maybe it wouldn't work. But in the process of figuring that out, we would develop resources that would be very helpful to Washington communities. We might develop like regional tree lists or regional tree guides. We would have a statewide land analysis that would show where there's opportunities for more planting, right? So that like there would be an upside to it as well. So I've kind of taken a somewhat neutral stance on it in this legislative session, knowing that it's a tough budget year and this would require additional funding to pull it off, and that puts it in a tough spot in this session.
I very much appreciate your thoughts on this, because I thought the same thing. Particularly, there's a lot of work that would be involved from DNR, and I thought it would be that would require a great deal of money just to implement what is being expected of you. So, thank you.
The one thing I'll note, just to, I won't wax poetic on this, the version of the bill this year does de-emphasize tree banks as the primary option. It does talk about kind of Mike's point about the mitigation hierarchy of avoiding, minimizing, offsetting. So it is a different kind of bill than it has been in prior years.
Yeah, it's made improvements over the years, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna hand it off to Janine. It looks like you have a question as well.
Yeah, it feeds into what we were just talking about in terms of the in lieu of fees. So I'm curious. First of all, I've had a lot of experience here in Thurston County of there being, in lieu of fees charged, and then never knowing where those fees go. And since we have so many people from cities and agencies here, I'm wondering, shouldn't that be more transparent about what is being done with that money? Are they, buying other lands? Are they planting trees? How is that being used? And I think it's a weak solution. I would much rather see jurisdictions prioritizing not, that not happening and bearing down harder on developers to keep trees on site. But given that it's happening and it happens a lot around here, what's being done with all those funds?
That's a great question, Mike. I saw your hand come up. Is that in a
Yeah,
response?
I mean, I can't speak for other communities, but I can speak for Tacoma. So in our municipal code, we actually explicitly state what they can and can't be used for and where they can and can't be used. So the value of the in lieu fee collected is to essentially offset the planting of the same diameter inches as what was removed, but not just the planting, but then also the follow-on maintenance establishment of those trees as well. And that impact has to be done in the same watershed that the trees were removed from. So we did kind of this like fiscal analysis and legal analysis too to figure out is there specific geography of focus for that? And what we landed on was those impacts have to be made in the exact same watershed as the trees were removed from to kind of not neutralize, but to have like hopefully not a significant net loss of benefits.
Who would be doing that? Who would be doing that work?
Me.
So it'd be the urban forester figuring out where the trees should go and then actually making that happen.
Yeah, so when we collect the in lieu fees, essentially through our permitting process, I have an in lieu fee bank account that is storing these fees based on watershed. And so when the fees, again for Tacoma, when they accumulate to a threshold that actually makes sense to fund a project, that's when I essentially mobilize to make a project happen in that watershed for tree planting.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ananda, looks like you've got a hand up. We can...
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and this is going to kind of pivot us from what we were talking about. So, um, when you're prioritizing tree planting, in like opportunity zones and areas that have lower canopy, I'm wondering if you've had any thought about strategies to reduce green gentrification, because one thing that studies have shown, especially in like Pacific Northwest cities like Portland, Seattle, is that when we do increase tree canopy in underserved neighborhoods, especially previously redline neighborhoods, green gentrification is something that happens. And obviously, we want to increase trees there, but what are some strategies, if any, that you've thought of um, to kind of work alongside with increasing tree canopy so that people aren't displaced from their neighborhoods?
I'm happy to chime in on this one too, but I don't want to take away from others who might have thoughts. Okay, I'll hop in. A strategy that Tacoma uses for our tree canopy enhancement projects, specifically in the right of way, is all of our stuff is voluntary. So we don't show up into a neighborhood and plant a bunch of street trees without the essentially participation of that neighborhood itself. And so we have all of our tree planting is typically through incentive-based programs, free tree giveaway stuff. We have a really strong tie and relationship with the Tacoma Tree Foundation, which is our local nonprofit supporting kind of the community building aspect of tree planting. And so we, being conscious of the potential for green gentrification, all that we do is in partnership with the community so that they can make those choices for themselves as to whether or not they want to plant the trees. That's kind of our approach for, again, this in lieu fee funding and the incentive programs that we run to support tree increases in Tacoma.
Thanks, Mike. And I'll just note that Heidi's dropped a bunch of resources in the chat too. I don't know, Heidi, if you want to say anything.
No, just take a look. I mean, we were looking at this issue for a long time, and actually at the University of Washington, there was a whole conference on this issue, but it was probably at least 5 years ago. And so it's probably time to revisit this. There are some interesting examples that are borrowed from brownfield and infill development that can be used here, and there's certain tools. So just take a look, and if you want any, I can send you what I have.
Great, thank you. Mark, you're up.
All right, thank you. Thank you. So one of the speakers presented a list of tree benefits. I think people's perceptions of tree benefits. Maybe it was Aileen. And I was surprised that climate resiliency was the bottom of the list. And I wonder, any thoughts about what's going on there? I would have expected it to be higher, or people are more interested, see more tangible, immediate benefits as higher priority, or I wonder about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think I don't know for sure, but I think I noticed people responded about heat, maybe at high and seeking shade and things separately, sometimes from climate resilience. So I think there's some like overlapping. People might see immediate threats like heat stress in the summer that they don't always like connect immediately to climate. So there's sort of like those kinds of issues where that's possibly one reason why climate might come up lower, just because people are more concerned with their like immediate well-being and might think of climate as a longer term thing.
All right, thank you. I'm going to actually point to a question in the chat that we had for the panel. I'm just going to read it verbatim, and it is, what is the numerical answer to the webinar subject? What is the panel's recommended balance of housing and tree canopy within urban, low-rise, multifamily areas? And roughly, what percent of that balance is within public land versus privately owned land? Is 330, 300 a good universal answer?
I can jump in on that, Rebecca. So someone else had asked a question about the 330, 300 and like, isn't it based on research? And it's like the answer is sort of. So my understanding of that, like that paper, that assessment that came up with that concept, it's based on an assessment of research done in different countries at different times on different slices of this question, and taking the sort of findings from those studies and kind of putting them all together and say, if all of these studies talked to each other, what would their final recommendation be? And that's where the 330, 300 came from. And so I think while it's very useful, first of all, it's very marketable. 330, 300 just kind of rolls off the tongue. And I think like over the years, like American Forest did canopy studies 30 years ago that suggested 30% canopy in residential neighborhoods. So it's like, broadly speaking, like 30% canopy in like R1, R2 residential development seems like a average goal. There's kind of a natural break in the data if you're looking at tree canopy analysis by zoning type, and that the residential areas, it seems like that's an average number, right? So it's not based on nothing. But the challenge of it is that, do we get to paint everywhere with that same brush? And I don't know that that's the right answer. So, you could theoretically, in a very high density area, very urbanized area, you might be able to put 3 trees within view of someone's window. They might also be very small trees, and that may not achieve 30% canopy coverage, right? Or that may not be within 300 meters of a green space. So another way to think about it is like 30% may be way too lofty a goal in a high desert landscape in a community in Eastern Washington. And maybe it's not enough in Western Washington. Like we have way more productive soils. We have a lot more access to water compared to Eastern Washington. So should we be doing better than 30%? The answer is like, I don't really know. And that's part of the challenge, is that we don't have like regionally specific targets based on best available science. We're just taking kind of like general feedback and advice and kind of painting that broadly across the landscape. So I do tend to think 30% in residential neighborhoods is a good target, but is it the right target everywhere? Is it the right target depending on what kind of housing? I don't know. But for single family or like, duplex style, like low density housing, I guess you would call it, in an urban space on city lots, I think 30% is fine.
Thanks, Ben. That was a question for the panel, so I don't know if Mike or Eileen or Max want to chime in as well, and that'll bring us up to the end of the session.
But 30% is definitely too much in the high desert. So
I think the only thing that I'll add to Ben's comment about it depends is it depends. No, I think I'll go back to an earlier statement that I made in the presentation, which is for any goal to be sustainable, it needs to be based on community values for your specific community. It's so important to, again, have the regulations and policies reflective of your local politics, your local community ethos, like the things that your people value. You cannot copy and paste somebody else's goal into your community. It will not work. It will not sustain itself. And so just adding to the comment about, different numbers, best available science might not say 30, it might say 35 or 40 or whatever the thing is. But even more important, the underpinning of that should be what is going to speak to my community's goals. And that's where I'll leave that.
All right.
I think the values part of that is really important. That mentioned a few times the right tree, right place, and like even right tree is a hard game to play because you're talking about stormwater, you're talking about wildlife habitat, you're talking about some aspect of aesthetics, heat mitigation. They may not all be right tree for any one of those goals, and so what are you maximizing on is not always super clear. As far as a numerical answer, just for fun, at least with our data we have from Western Washington, at the highest density we are measuring for housing anywhere in Western Washington, you don't like 30% is kind of like a maximum you can actually seem to get. We don't really see many high density places being above 30%, but in the low to medium range, kind of to Ben's point, you do see places that are kind of in like the 30 to 70% range with tree canopy cover. So there are places that are keeping pretty high canopies. Whether that should be a goal or not is a different question. But it is possible. Getting above 30 when you get super high density becomes really hard, but also not impossible.
All right, thank you. Eileen, I'm just noticing your question in the chat, so I want to bring people's attention to it. We're running out of time, but you can contact Eileen and answer her question for the planners. What tools or research or synthesis would be helpful for you? What science products would help you make it easier to avoid the tree loss? So I guess I'll leave it with that. It's something you can think on for those of you who are able and interested. We can talk about it down at the Uptown Grill in Olympia, where we'll have a networking event starting in about 15 minutes from here. And then I just want to give a huge thank you to all of our speakers and the whole team to help put this together because this was really great. I was telling somebody that I wish we had 5 hours because I just want to hear everything that you all know and worked on. I'm doing really great work. And then we will be sharing. We've recorded the whole session. We will share the recording probably sometime next week on our YouTube channel. And there were a lot of requests for the chat. I'm going to share that too. And I've also captured some ideas to some things to share out that our speakers have mentioned, resources and that sort of thing. And the AICP credits are still pending. I guess there was a slowdown. So those of you who want to claim those credits, we will let you know when they are available to claim. And with that, again, thank you so much for attending, your great questions, your active chat information. The speakers are wonderful. And Heidi and Will and Veronica and folks who helped put this together too, that were in the
Hey, have fun at the
on the
party.
team.
Record your conversations.
Thank you, everybody.